Good morning. Thank you very much to all participants connected to this training session, and thank you to our host institution, CITO, the Central Information and Technology Office there in Belmopan, Belize. My name is Mike Mora, and I'm a specialist with the Department for Effective Public Management of the Organization of American States. Welcome all to the 4 dedicated training in open data of the project promoting an open government ecosystem in Belize, implemented by the Trust for the Americas and the Department for Effective Public Management of the OAS with the support of the Embassy of the United States of America in Belize. In this session, we will learn about the technical aspects of creating data sets, that is about how to open in data. As mentioned in our last training session, these open data training sessions that we started are oriented to a reduced group of government officers that for the purpose of this project, we consider the Open Government Champions Network of Belize. Our goal is to embrace, specialize, and develop skills in a dedicated group of officers to innovate, transcend, and improve public service delivery through open government. And with that, this group can become agents of change in doing so. So I want to thank you all for your attendance and commitment. Please let our local project coordinator, Mr. Henry Wade, who's connected, is responding on the chat, and we're going to hear from him at the Q&A session about how to engage with this project, with this open government project. As a reminder, for our Q&A session at the end, please prepare your questions and share them throughout the presentation using the chat tool of this platform. We will collect the questions and have them ready for the speaker once her presentation is done. So please do not hesitate. Send us your questions as you have them. Now, without further ado, I would like to present the speaker of the day. She's Camila Salazar. You can see her in the screen right now. She's a data journalist and an open data activist from Costa Rica. She currently works as a data trainer and consultant and as a data journalist professor at the University of Costa Rica. She previously worked to investigate on the investigation unit of the La Nación newspaper in Costa Rica and other media outlets in the country. So hopefully we can get a lot of insight about the use of open data in this sector. In 2015, she was a School of Data Fellow. This is an international project that works to empower civil society, organizations, journalists, and citizens with the skills they need to use data effectively. She has been working with the international open data community ever since, so it's a pleasure to have you in this session, Camila. She has a bachelor's degree in economics and another degree in journalism from the University of Costa Rica. So this is it on my side. Welcome again, Camila. I will have your presentation up and running now, and I will say goodbye to my camera and let you lead the presentation from this point and on.
Okay. Thank you, Mike, for the presentation, and good morning, everyone. For me, it's a pleasure to be sharing this session with you, and I hope that we can share a lot of experiences and learn throughout this session this morning. As Mike said, I work right now as a data trainer and consultant, and I've been working with the open data community for the last 3 or 4 years. And the idea of this session is to explain to you some of the technical aspects on how to open data. Once you know the principles and the characteristics that open data sets must have, you might have questions on how do you implement these policies within your organizations. So the idea is that I will be, The agenda of this session is basically to explain some data architecture basics, what are the principles that open data must have, and how the structured information looks like. Also, I'm going to tell you about how to get and create or extract data in your organizations in order to open it. A little bit about data cleaning and formatting. There are 2 really important steps throughout the open data process, and also about data interoperability. As Mike said, I'm going to be talking throughout this session, and if you have any questions, please write them down, and I will answer them throughout the session or after the presentation. Well, to begin with, we're going to talk a little bit about data basics, and I'm pretty sure that you might already, throughout this course that you're taking, you already have talked a little bit about what's open data. But it's important to be clear on what's open data in order to explain all these principles and all these structures. So if you already know it, it doesn't matter, but I'm going to repeat it. So basically, open data is information which can be freely used, reused, and redistributed by anyone, anywhere, for any purpose. As that means that it has to be data sets that are available for free so that the users can just download it and create insights and knowledge out of this data that the government is producing. And open data has to have two specific things also. It has to be legally open, and that has to do about some question that was stated before. That it has to be available under an open data license that permits anyone freely to access, reuse it, and redistribute it. And the idea of this is that if a user finds a data set online, it has to be clear what he can or cannot do with this data. An example of this is, for instance, I remember that a few years ago, the National Institute of Costa Rica, when you ask for a database, for example, of a national survey, you had to sign a document that says that you couldn't redistribute that database to anyone. You could just use it for your research purposes, and you couldn't upload it online or anything. So this is something that we need to avoid when you make datasets available for the public, and the public needs to know for sure what he can do with the data. And at the end, I can share you a few links of licenses that I recommended for open data projects that help to avoid these issues. And also, open data needs to be technically open, and that means that it has to be available in a machine-readable format. For example, there might be available information that's on paper, but in that case, the reuse and redistribution of that data becomes quite difficult. So we have to make it accessible on a digital format and a structured machine-readable format. I'm going to talk about formats a little bit after. And also in bulk form. And bulk form means that the entire data set must be available for download instead of just putting parts of the data set online. So for instance, if you have the National Household Survey, you should have the survey online available for download instead of just having tables about the number of households in poverty or specific variables and cross tables of that information, okay? So once we have these principles, there is also another list of principles that open data must have when we open it. And I took a list here about a list of principles by this online foundation. There's a big list. I put what I believe are the most important that you need to take into account when you're opening data sets. And the first one is completeness. And that means that data sets released by the government should be as complete as possible, reflecting the entirety of what is recorded about a particular subject. And as I said, this is related to what I was saying before about bulk format, that you need to try to put online all the information that's available and not just parts of it. So a good example of this might be, for example, if you're the transport minister and you collect information about the companies that provide public transportation services, you might collect information about the name of the company, its ID number, the number of routes, the number of miles that it covers, etc. And if you put this database available online, you should make it available with all the variables that you collected and not just part of the information. The only parts of the information that you should exclude from a database are those subject to privacy concerns. And about privacy concerns, this depends on the national legislation, but mostly it has to do with subjects of national security and private information, for example, health information, or tax information, but it really depends on the national legislation. So what I recommend is that you see which legislation applies about access to information, and that you should remind yourselves also that when it comes about public information and information that public institutions produce, pretty much all the information is public. Even, for example, wages about public servants, because at least in most of the legislation, it's possible to publish this information because it has public interest. So my recommendation is that you search your national legislation regarding what information is private and which is not. The other principle that's important to take into account is primacy. And also, this means that the data sets that you publish should be primary source data. And that means that you have, if you're an institution, you probably are going to collect information, and the users need to know for sure how this information was collected and search for the original source of these documents, so to verify if the information was collected properly and recorded accurately. Also, data sets should have easy access, and they should be as accessible as possible without barriers. And that should mean that downloading data sets from the government should be as easy as going into a website and just click on a link and download the database. You should avoid, for example, forcing the people to log in order to download the information, or explain why do you need this information. Information should be accessible, as I said, to everyone without barriers. And sometimes for example, for me as a journalist, what happened before is when you needed information from a public institution, what you usually did was that you contacted the press office of the institution, and you ask for that information, and then this person would go and search for the information inside the institution. And the idea with open data is to get rid of all these processes that are time costly, and just to make things easier for the final users. Right now, I just can go online and download the data set that I need for my research, for my story, for whatever use I wanna give to the data. Okay. Also, as I said, information should be in a machine-readable format, should be stored in widely used formats that are easily lend themselves to machine processing. I'm going to explain to you a little bit more about these formats, which are the most common. And that means avoid PDFs, avoid paper files. You should try to publish structured and open information. And other two principles that are really important that you need to take into account is timeliness and permanence. And timeliness is that the idea is that open data is only valuable if it's still relevant. So for instance, something that happens a lot with open data portals is that, for example, you have an open data portal and you publish data sets from 2015. And now we are in 2018 and this information hasn't been updated. So it's not that relevant anymore. And the idea is that the government should publish information as quickly as it is gathered and collected, so that it's still relevant for the final users. And permanence means that it should be available online in archives in perpetuity, and that means that, for example, if you upload a data set, you should not delete it. And if you make changes to the data set, these changes should be recorded and let the user know why this information was changed. For example, if you uploaded a data set and you discovered afterwards that it has errors, you can delete it and upload a new one, but you should record that change. And that means that what we try to do with these principles is that the users must know for sure what information is there, how fast is it updated, and know if there were some changes in the information. You shouldn't do these changes arbitrarily without letting the users know, because the final end is transparency with the final users, okay? So this, as I said, are some of the basic principles. And the idea is that when you're going to start an open data process, you should list all those principles and see that your different data sets comply with these principles, so that they have this open data formats and have the needed structure in order to publish it. So, as I said, what we're interested here is in publishing information in open data formats, in machine readable formats, and there are a few formats that are widely used when we see open data portals, and one of the most common is a file called CSV file, that it stands for comma separated values, and it looks something like this. If you see here, for example, it says school name, comma, school type, comma, etc., and that's how the variables are listed. If you import this file, for example, in a spreadsheet, in an Excel file, or in a Google Sheets file, it's going to look like a spreadsheet, like a structure file. And it's widely used as an open data format because it's free. You don't need a specific program to open these files. So pretty much everyone can use it regardless of the programs or the information of the programs they have. They don't need a license to open CSV files because it can be read, as I said, in spreadsheet programs and also in more complex formats like statistical software, okay? So CSV is a well-recommended file type to publish your data. We also have spreadsheet files that are widely common, but the problem with spreadsheet is that some files might be proprietary. Excel, for instance, if you're going to use Microsoft Excel, you're going to need a Microsoft license, so that might be a barrier for some people. Even though in practice you can open an Excel file in OpenOffice or in Google Spreadsheets. But the idea is, if you're going to choose between spreadsheets and CSV, it might be better to put the information in a CSV file in order to avoid barriers of access, okay? My recommendation is that you can publish files, the same data set, in different formats so that you cover different types of user, okay? There are also text files that are similar to CSV files, but instead of being separated by a comma, it's tabular data, so it's segmented by a tab. But it's also an easy file that you can import in a spreadsheet program. And we have other types of formats, such as the JSON file, that stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And I don't know if a few of you are programmers, so you might be familiar with this format. This is a useful format, as I said, for programmers or more technical users. But it's a format that's also open and accessible. My recommendation is which files should you choose? The idea is to know your final user. If you have expert users, then you might choose to upload your information on a JSON file. But if your users are not that technical, maybe it's better to upload your information in a CSV file. Or you can upload it in the 3 different formats so that the user has a range of options to choose. And what you must avoid for sure is to publish information in PDFs. And I know that PDFs are widely common in government information. You publish a lot of reports on PDFs, and this is a format that might be useful for some users because your final interest might be just to look out for information on a report. But a PDF is not a structured file. So for instance, if you have a table on a PDF with numbers, you can do calculations or analysis out of that image. So you should avoid, if you have data, numbers, or information that's stored in a PDF, and we're going to see how to transform this later in the session, you should prefer open formats instead of a PDF file, okay? And here is a graph that pretty much synthesized what I said. There are a lot of formats like RDF or HTML that are also open formats, as I said, more for technical users. But the idea is that here you have on the right side what are considered open formats, and also on the y-axis at the top you have structured information. So what you're looking for is structure and open information. There's 3 type files at the top: HP, KML, and GeoJSON are for geographic data that I'm not going to talk about here in this session, but if you're familiar with geographic data, you might use this kind of formats. And there's CSV and RDF are formats that are more used for structured data in spreadsheets. You can see here that, for example, an Excel file it's structured, but it's in a closed format. So the idea is that you choose from a range of options depending on your technical capacities and also on the final characteristics of your final users, okay? And how does it look like? How does structured information look like? And you might, I've been talking a lot about, well, these formats and how does it look like, but I'm gonna see an example here. Mike, I don't know if you can share my screen so that I can show a website, an open data website.
Just a second, I'll give you the rights for it.
Okay. Okay. Okay, there you go. You can see my screen. This is, for example, a website. It's a simple website of open data in the judiciary branch here in Costa Rica. And here, these are statistics about crimes throughout the country. But as you can say here at the beginning, I know that it's in Spanish, but the idea is that you have here at the beginning a description of your data set. You have the title of this data set, the unique URL where you can find it. You have this is really important, the date of publication. As I said, timeliness is really important. So the user must know for sure when it was last published. And also here you have, this is called the frequency of update. This is said that this database is updated every month. So these two aspects are really important to have in an open data portal, that the user knows for sure how often is it updated and when was it last updated. You can say here that it has some formats, and down here you have the data sets available in different formats. So this is what I was saying, that when you create a portal and you make data sets available, you can use different file types and formats. So here is information in an RDF file, a CSV file, an XLM, XLS file. And it depends on what are your final users. You can share from a range of options. And also something that's really important here that I'm going to talk about later is that you have metadata or documentation about what the database has. And here is a list of variables. What do they mean? What's the type of the format of this variable? So this is really important also to have in a database, okay? And once you download the information, structured information looks something like this, where you have this is a spreadsheet and you have columns. Each column is a variable and each row is an observation. And this is what structured data pretty much look like. This is what you are trying to look forward when you publish your data, okay? You have a variable and then rows, you have each of the observations, okay? So let me go back here to the session. Okay.
Want to go back to the
okay. Yeah, to the presentation, please. Okay. Okay. So here, as I said, well, it's just an image of how does a CSV file of a CSV file, and this is the same example as the database that I was showing you, where you have variables in each column and observations in each row, okay? And the idea behind this this open data and why it's important to open data is that this is an example of a project that I worked on a few years ago. We had, for example, I was working, as I said, in a national newspaper, and we had municipal elections. And what we wanted to do was to have a list of all the candidates running for the different posts around the country and to make an investigation to see if they had, if they were being investigated by justice, if they had debts with Social Security, etc. So when we go and ask for this information to the electoral institution, they give us this one, the image you can see at the left, that it's a closed PDF. This is just an image of how it looked like. There were around like 300 pages of information about the candidates, and it says, for example, here San Jose, this is the province the region, the party, the post, the ID number, and the number of the person. And you have this in a closed PDF in a vertical format. So we couldn't pretty much do much with that information because it was in a closed format. For example, we couldn't even make a simple calculation of how many candidates were running in each region or around the country. And what we had to do, this was information that was available, it was for free, but it was in a closed format. So what we had to do as journalists was that we had to transform this PDF into an open format, a structured data in a CSV file, and to obtain something like this at the end where you had this in variables, in rows, etc. And this was a process that took a few days to cover, but it's an example of if you're an institution and you collect this information. My question is, why do you collect this in this format if you can structure it in this other format that it's more easy to access? And for instance, we had presidential elections this year in February, and now the Electoral Tribunal is publishing this information in a structured format. So it's a good example of if you are civil society, if you're the final users, you can let the institutions know which ways are best to publish the information in order for you to use it. And the idea of having a structured data is that at the end, what we did with this data was to create. This is an image of the web app that we created. But we created an application where each voter could search for their candidate and see if it has, see their curricula, see if they had been previously investigated, etc. And they had information. We transformed this raw data in a closed format into information that was valuable for the voters in this case, and that produced knowledge. And that's what you try to do when you open data. To allow users to reuse it in order to create valuable information and knowledge out of the information that the public institutions publish, okay? So this is a good example of a good case where we have closed data and we open it in order to create knowledge, okay? So well, this is like the first part of the session. And once you know for sure, for example, what are the principles and in which formats should you publish your information, question that might arise is, well, where do I get this data? I wanna start an open data process in my institution, but I don't know which data to publish or where is it? How do I structure it? And this is the second part. And my first recommendation is to where's your data is that the first thing you should do is to make an inventory inside your institution. Public institutions collect a lot of information on a daily basis and collect and produce a lot of information. So what you should do is that you should make an inventory in the different departments of the institution to make a list of what information do you have. So for instance, the financial department might have information about public budget or public spending, but another department, for example, might have information about public contracts. And another one might have information about wages or about projects that the institution is investing in. So you should make an inventory and list who has this information, that's it, which departments, which people is in charge of collecting this information, and in which formats. And you might find that, for instance, you might already have information that's being collected on structured formats, such as spreadsheets. So the process of opening this data might not be that difficult. Or, on the other hand, you might find that your information is on paper. And you should, if it's valuable information, you shouldn't discard this information. But you should try to think of strategies on how can you transform this paper information to digital formats, okay? Another good thing to consider when you're trying to see which data to publish is to try to know your final users. For example, a good way of knowing who are your final users is to talk to the press. If you have a press office within your institution, they might know which is the information that citizens or final users ask more often. So this might give you a light of what information should you look for in your institution, okay? And another thing that might happen is that you might find a lot of information that you have in your institution, but it's stored as PDF files. And as I said, PDF is a format that is widely common on government institutions. For example, this is a table that the National Statistics Institute published with information regarding a household survey, and it's in PDF. These are numbers, but stored in a PDF file. Or you might have a file like this, that it's the wages of all the public servants in a public university, but it's also in a PDF file. So as I said, if it's in a PDF, it's hard to make calculation, and it's a closed format. So what do you do if you have all these PDFs inside your institution? A good thing is that there are tools to transform this into open data formats. I truly recommend a tool called Tabula. It's a free tool available online that's super easy to use. If you're interested, I can share you a tutorial that's pretty simple to use. You basically upload your PDF, you select the tables that you want to transform, and then this program transforms this into a CSV file, to an open format. And for example, the example that I showed you before about opening data of municipal servants in the country, we use Tabula to open this PDF into a CSV file, okay? So as I said, it's pretty much easy. It's pretty easy to use. But also, a good advice is that if you're a government institution and you created a PDF report with a table with numbers, this information came out of somewhere. And you might want to search for the primary source of information. So, for example, if you have a table about the public wages that's stored in a PDF report, this information might be maybe in an open format in another department. So it might be already in an Excel file or in a CSV file. So you can skip this step of transforming your information on the CSV file because you might already have it. And as I said, a good thing is that when you start this open data processes, if you make an inventory of what information are you producing and collecting, you might have a big panorama of that you might not be aware before. That you actually have a lot of information that is structured, and the only thing you need to do is, well, to clean it a little bit and to open it and put it available online, okay? And another thing that might happen, another thing that might happen is that you might have information that's on paper, and that's also pretty common in institutions. You might have, for example, something like this, that's a ledger of local government, that it's stored in beautiful tables in a notebook. And even though if this notebook can be available for consultation for the public, it's in paper, so you can pretty much do anything with it instead of just transcribe it into digital formats. And what do you do if you have information on paper? Should you just discard it from the open data process? My advice is, do not do this, because you might have really valuable information that's on paper, and that if you start a digitalizing process, it might be information that it's really valuable for the final users. And a good example of this is also a few years ago, I worked on a project. We were trying to make an investigation about all the rentals of the executive branch of the government. So as a journalist, I called the institutions to see if they could send me an Excel file of all the contracts. And what I found is that they didn't have it online. They didn't have it in a digital format, and they had it only on paper. So what I had to do, this is an image of one of the contracts. What I had to do is that I had to go to all these institutions to see all these paper files, these documents, and start building a database out of these documents. And my advice when you do this is, the first thing you need to be clear at the beginning is, which variables do you want to collect from these paper documents? And having this thing, you need to be clear with this at the beginning, because it would make your process easier. So for instance, in this case, I was interested in the number of the contract, the ID number of the procurement process, the number of the enterprise, its ID number, etc., etc. And I built this database, as I said, with the contracts of the public administration to get something like this at the end. Structure information of each institution, the procedure, which part of the department had bought it, the ID number, etc. And I had a lot of variables with which I was able to do an analysis afterwards and create valuable insights out of this data. So the idea is that if you have paper documents, you definitely can transform that into structured formats. It might be costly, it might be difficult, it might take you time, but if it's information that's really valuable, you should definitely transform it into digital formats. How do you do this? As I said, the first thing is that you need to identify the variables and formats. You must find ways of digitalize the information. And a good advice is that, for example, if you have 400 contracts on paper, yeah, that might take you some time, and you might not have resources to have a specific person dedicated to do this job for 3 weeks in your institution. So a good way is to ask for help. You can ask for help for civil society or journalists in order to help you make this information accessible. And even though it's not the subject of this talk, maybe you've already talked about this throughout this course. The importance of when you're starting an open data process, it's really important to have a strong open data community, which you can interact, have activities, and get them involved in your open data process. Because open government, it has not only to do with the government, it needs also civil society to be involved in the process. So a good way of creating a community is to get people involved in this initiative. So for example, you can have an event on a one-day event where you reunite people, journalists, people from NGOs that are willing to participate in opening, for example, public contracts and make it available in a digital format, okay? So this is a good tip if you want to engage with the community. What are the cons of this process? Is that, as I said, it's labor intensive. It's time consuming. I remember when I was doing this investigation, I spent like a month transcribing and digitalizing contracts. So it's really time consuming, and it's also subject to human error. If you already had been spending 4 hours digitalizing information, yes, you might make a mistake when you type something. So if you do this process, it's really important also to have someone to verify the errors and correct possible human errors that were committed throughout the process. Okay? And also what might happen is that, well, you might have information in PDFs on paper, but you might encounter information that's also in other formats. And a good example of this is, for example, this year I asked for the Costa Rican Congress for information about the congressmen that were attending each session of the Congress, and they have in the Congress a dedicated department that collects this information. So every day they collect the name of the congressman that attended the session, if he attended or not, the date, etc. And they collect this information on a daily basis. But the thing is that they store it in a Word document, a text file. So when they send me the information, well, it was in a Word document, and I had to copy this information, put it on a spreadsheet in order to analyze. So my question was that this is a department that's already collecting information. So a good thing is to talk to these departments that are already collecting valuable information, but advise them to start collecting it in structured formats. So as a process, it shouldn't be that different from storing information on a Word file. For example, this department could definitely put this information on a spreadsheet and start structuring it in open structured formats. So this is a good advice also, that you should talk to the departments of the institution and see in which ways they are collecting the information, and if it's possible to change these formats into open formats so that it's easier. You're already collecting information in open formats, so it's easier to just upload it afterwards in your open data portal, okay? And then another important things that you need to take into account. Well, you know the formats. You found out where's your data. You know that the department has it in structured formats in a CSV file. So is it ready to publish already? Well, I would say no. You need to go through the cleaning step of the open data process. You need to clean your data and make sure that the information that you publish is tidy and neat and doesn't have any errors, okay? And basically, cleaning data, it's processing a data set to make it easier to consume. So this might involve fixing inconsistencies in the data, errors, removing weird characters or non-machine readable elements, making sure that each variable has the right format, etc. You need to make your data tidy and clean before publishing it. And what I mean by tidy data, and I really recommend this article here by someone called Hadley Wickham. It's a bit technical, but it has really good examples of what tidy data is. So the two basic principles of tidy data is that each variable is saved in its own column, as we saw before in an example, and each observation is saved in its own row, okay? These are two principles that a tidy data must have. And for example, this definitely doesn't look like a tidy data set because you have strange characters, you have colors, you have different formats. Here you have numbers stored with text. So this is really a non-tidy data set, and it's really clear to see that it's not tidy. But you might also encounter something like this, that it's a data set that might look structured, it looks structured, but if you look carefully, for example, this column that's called price euros, it has a number, but it also has a weird character here. So, okay, maybe we should delete this character. So this is also how non-tidy data might look like. Or it might look like this, that this is the example of that I showed you before about the candidates running for their local governments that was in a PDF file. So when I transformed it into a CSV file, it looked like this. So even though it was in an open format already, it wasn't structured. So I needed to clean the data set because I had all the variables, all the information in a single column. And what I needed to do is to create different columns with the information, okay? So this had to go through a long cleaning process. So the idea is that at the end, with clean data, you have variables in a correct format. You don't have merged cells. That means when you have two columns in one, you should avoid that. A single value per cell, no strange characters, and this happens a lot. For example, if you had, well, in Spanish, if you had accents or different characters that might not be well read in some programs, and you need to be sure that your data doesn't have errors, okay? What are the most common errors that you might find in your data? You might have data stored in the wrong format, and like, for example, well, this is actually, I made a mistake here, is for example, if you have numbers stored as text. Because if you have a number that is stored as a text, if you try to do, for example, a simple calculation like a sum, you won't be able to do it because it's going to give you an error because it isn't stored as a number, it's stored as a text. Or for example, you might have, you need to be really careful when you use dates. Because, for example, if you see this, it depends if your file is in English or in Spanish. This might be the same date, or this might be different dates. Is it September? If it's September the 12th, or is it the 9th of December? We don't know, and it depends on the format that you're using for the date. As I before in the example that I showed you about the open data portal of the judiciary branch. They had, it said which format they use for the date. So it's really important that you know this for sure. And also each column should have only one data type. And I'm gonna see an image here, for example. For example, you shouldn't have a number and a text in the same column. You should avoid that. And also, you should avoid multiple values in columns. And you should avoid things like this, where you have, for example, absolute numbers mixed with percentages. This should be two different variables, and not having this in a single variable, because, again, if you try to make a calculation with this, you won't be able to do this because this is stored as a text, okay? And also, you might encounter problems like this, where you have different variables in a single cell. So you must split the cell into different variables and clean these variables before publishing it. This is an example of having multiple values in a cell. If you see the image on the left, in the column that's actually called column, you see here, for example, that we have M and some numbers, and F and some numbers. And this is actually two different variables stored in one single column. And what you should do when you're cleaning this data set is to split that column into two different columns, as you can see on the right. In this case, it was a column called sex, where M stands for male and F for female, and then an age variable, where you have different age ranges in this case. So you should definitely avoid having this, like the example on the left, and instead trying to split this into two different variables. Remember, each variable must have a unique value and not different formats or different variables in one column. And another common mistake is typing errors. And this happens because when we collect information, it's always subject to human error. So, for example, in this table right here, it's the name of a person. And for example, in the second row, we have a blank space at the beginning, and at the last row, we had two blank spaces in the middle. So even though it's the same name, it's written in different ways. So the program will read it as three different values, when actually it's the same value. So you should be careful with this typing errors. And another thing that happens a lot is, for example, when you use acronyms versus full names. So, for example, the University of Costa Rica, its acronym is UCR, and people normally say UCR to refer to the university. And if you find in a data set that you have the two names, you have University of Costa Rica and UCR, you should unify them into a single value. For example, if you're going to refer to the University of Costa Rica, all the values must be UCR or the complete name. But you can have both because, as I said, it's going to be read as two different values when it actually corresponds to a single one, okay? So you should avoid this. And another common mistake of non-tidy data is when you have something like this. This is actually a table. You should avoid tables. You should have databases, not tables. And at the top, these columns are actually, this should be a variable called income instead of just having this in a long format as variables, because how you call, these are values of a variable and not variables itself. So if you want to make this data tidy, it should look like this, where you have a variable called income, and here you have, for example, let me go back to this. Here, for example, you have religion agnostic with an income less than 10K. The frequency is 27, and in this range, the frequency is 34. So if you have it on a tidy format, here you have agnostic, 10K, 27, agnostic, in this other range, 34. So instead of having it in a long format, you have this in a single variable, and then you have the frequency. That's what you should look forward in a clean database. Avoid this and instead have something that looks like this. And if you want to know more in detail on how to clean data or what type of errors are common in your databases in order to avoid them when you're opening your information, I recommend these 2 links. This is a guide. It's called the Guide to Bad Data that lists some of the most common errors that you might find in databases and that you need to avoid. And also this article, as I said, that has a lot of examples on how untidy data, and also if you are familiar with a statistical software called R, it gives you an example of how to clean this data and make it tidy. Okay. And also something that's really, really important that you consider in your cleaning process, it's to create documentation of your data set. And this is called metadata, that it's basically information about a data set that must include, for example, a title, a description, how is this information collected, who is the author, the license, and also to make a list of the variables and what do they mean. This is really important because the users, as I said, need to know for sure what does the database contain and what are the variables, which are the formats, because if you're not sure about this, you might make wrong analysis with this information. So for example, if you download a database from the Ministry of Education about, and you have this variable called level of education, and you have 1, 5, 3, 1, 4, you might think, well, does this mean that the person is in 1st grade, or does it have 1 year of schooling, or does it mean that it's in his 1st year of the university? You don't know. If you don't have the right documentation, you don't know what this means, so this variable becomes useless. But if you have metadata, it will look something like this, where you have the name of the variable, what does it mean. So this is actually not a number variable, but it's a categorical variable with different codes. So 1 stands for elementary education, 2 for primary education, 5 for a bachelor degree or higher. So if you have the metadata, then you know for sure what does this variable means. So it's easier and you avoid mistakes when you're analyzing this data set. And as I said, this is really important that you create documentation with your database. And this is the example that I showed you before about the database of the judiciary branch here in Costa Rica, where you have all the list of variables, the description, the type of data, etc. You must create this when you upload a data set online. And this is another example of how metadata might look like. This is, for example, metadata on the household survey. So here's the name of the variable, which was the question that was asked in the survey in order to get this data, and the values. Here, the value of 1 means that it's a man, the value of 2 that it's a woman. So you know for sure, if you see the metadata, what does the variable means. So don't forget to create documentation in the cleaning stage of the data process. If you upload a dataset online without documentation, then it's pretty much useless because the users don't know for sure what they are encountering. So you need to create documentation, okay? And finally, I want to talk about something called interoperability. That's also a concept that's used when we talk about open data. And this basically means that this denotes the ability of diverse systems and organizations to work together. And in this case, when we're talking about open data, is the ability to interoperate or intermix different data sets. So the idea is that if you're the government and you're starting open data processes within your institutions, if you have structured information that complies with certain principles and standards, then it might be easier for government databases to communicate. So imagine, for example, that you're a public servant that is in charge of giving subsidies to families in poverty, but actually the subsidies are scattered in different institutions. So for example, the Ministry of Education gives subsidies to education, and another institution gives subsidies to single mothers, or to build to give housing to families in poverty. And if you have this information unstructured and in different departments, if you're this public servant that's in charge of seeing if a specific household or family is subject to this politics, you might have to go and search in these different departments and institutions. If the information is interoperable and the database can connect with each other, it should be as easier as that this person should type the ID number of this family, and the system will connect to different databases to see if this family is actually in poverty or if it already has a housing subsidy or a subsidy for education, etc. This makes processes more easy within the government and also for the final users. And a common thing when we talk about interoperability is that we talk about APIs. And APIs is basically stands for Application Programming Interface. And for data, this is usually a way provided by the data publisher, that means your institution, for programs or app to read data directly over the web. And this might sound complicated at the beginning. As I said, I'm a journalist, so I didn't understand quite well how API worked before. So it looks something like this. And a good example that helped me understand how an API works is that imagine, for example, if you go to a restaurant and you sit in a restaurant and you're given a menu where you can choose from a wide range of options. And the kitchen is the service provider that actually prepares your food and puts it in your table. But you need something to connect you to the kitchen, because you can't go straight into the kitchen and ask the chef to prepare your plate. So that's when the waiters comes into the equation. The waiter comes and takes your order, then it takes your order back to the kitchen prepares your order, and then the waiter takes your order to the table. That's what basically an API does. It's like the waiter. So you have a web browser or an application in the web, and this connects to the API and asks for an information request. Then the API connects to the database. It could be one database or multiple databases within the institution. It retrieves a response to the API, and then the API gives a response to the web app in the browser. And for example, you might have APIs, for example, for information that's updated quickly when you have vast amounts of information. So it should be more easy to just create an API instead of uploading data sets every day online. So basically, when you make an API available, you are allowing users to connect directly to your database systems to ask for information and to extract this information automatically. So for example, if you are, I don't know, an entrepreneur that wants to create an app about traffic accidents, and this information is being uploaded on real time in a government database about where are the accidents located around the country, then this programmer, this entrepreneur can connect to the API so that he can create a final product where you just log in into the app and see where the accidents are happening. And this makes processes more easy, especially to advanced users like programmers, or even some journalists use APIs. So the question might be, should I always, when I open datasets, create an API? No, it's not a requirement. It depends on your information. As I said, it might be useful if you have information that's uploaded really quickly, for example, car accidents or, I don't know, climate data about rainfall and other climate indicators. And if you have the technical capacities. My advice is that, for example, when you're making the inventory of your data, when you already identify which data sets are valuable for publication, that you have a meeting with your TI department to see if some of these data sets are subject to be opened through an API instead of just uploading the CSV files or the open data format files, okay? And the idea of this, of why interoperability is important, is, as I said, it really saves times for users and public servants. they can easily access and analyze data sets instead of going online and now downloading the databases. They can connect directly. And the fact also that the information is well structured and documented allows people to work with big data sets and vast amounts of information. And also it increases the consumption of information within institutions. If you're able to connect with different institutions of the government online with APIs or with or throughout the internet, then the processes within the government might become more efficient instead of just doing all the steps in person or going in person to the institution. So this might make information more accessible not only to the users but also to people inside the government. And the final remarks here is that please don't be afraid to start an open data process. It might sound a lot at the beginning to comply with the principles and getting the information and structuring it and cleaning, but the thing is that it's not that difficult. There are a lot of people that have already gone through this process and that can help you, that can orient you in what are the steps that you need to take. And you might already know this, but open data has a large potential economic value, increases transparency, creates business opportunities, benefits consumer, and at the end, the idea of opening data, it's also to allow users to create knowledge and valuable insights out of the information that the government is providing. So it's really important, and it's really a good thing that the government can do to start these processes to connect better with the final users, with the citizens, and to make information available, free, without a cost to everyone. So this is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. As I said, I hope you have questions and I can answer these questions. You're going to have the final presentation, so if you want to check on some of the links that I shared throughout the presentation, they're there in the presentation, so don't hesitate also to ask questions, and I'm here to help if you have any concerns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camila, for this great presentation. We dived certainly into more technical aspects that we have already seen in the last presentation. So thank you. I think we got to this point. We built up to this point, and so your presentation fits very well to this progressive way of introducing Belize and this group of officers to open data. So thank you very much for all the insights. It's great to see it in a simple way presented, although it's perhaps complicated once you start doing it. It takes a lot of time, as you mentioned, and so quality of information is key. And to have quality of information, of course, you need to make sure that you set the infrastructure in a way that will ease that process at the end. So great, thank you for all the insights. So we do have questions. Participants were actively putting questions from the very beginning. I would like to have Henry, the project work coordinator, to step in and help us moderating this part of the session. Thank you, Henry. And while Henry connects, Camila, please do stay connected on your cam so that we can see you while you respond. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Henry, are you there? Can you hear us? Can you hear you? Yes, of course. I might have to give you permissions. I'm sure that's what's happening. So you have permissions now. I apologize for not giving you the permissions. Hopefully you can turn. Here we go.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm getting feedback. Okay, there we go. Okay, yes. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Camila, for that excellent presentation. We're connecting with you, Mike noted, via Belize. And so far, this is our fourth session. It's been an incredible learning opportunity, I know for myself, and I guess I can speak for the other participants. I want to echo Mike's initial vote of thanks to our partners there at CETO. I know they're taking their time out. All the participants are taking their time out today. It's been wonderful having them available for these training sessions. I know it's really valuable for everyone at this point. Can you hear me, Gabrielle? Is that better? Are you guys hearing me clearly? Okay, perfect. Okay, perfect. Yes. I guess I was probably just a little further away from my microphone. Yes, but again, I was just thanking all the participants for taking their time out. It's been a wonderful training session thus far, and we want to thank everybody for doing that. So, as Mike noted, we're entering the Q&A session, Camila, and I wanted to start off with a question that Francisco, the acting director of CETO, the central IT office here in Belize, for the government of Belize, asked. He asked the first is in terms of legality and privacy concerns of, could you address perhaps some of the general legal and privacy concerns when these data sets are created?
Okay. Regarding legal and privacy concerns, as I said, my first recommendation should be to check the national legislation on what is considered public and private information. For example, I don't know if in Belize you have a Freedom of Information Act. Here in Costa Rica, for example, we don't have it. So all the legal aspects of accessing data are in the jurisdiction of the constitutional branch. But there are clear guidelines of what information is public or not. So my first recommendation is check your national legislation to see which information is public or not. Most commonly, what information, the information that's normally subject to privacy concerns, it has to do with the national security. And this is a thin line because sometimes governments might said that this information is not open because of national security interests, and actually, well, it doesn't comply with that aspect. So that might happen. But also information that's normally private is, for example, sensible information about individuals, for example, health. For example, my medical records shouldn't be public. This is private information. And also tax records. Normally, tax records aren't public. For example, you can know how much information, how much money did the government collected on taxes, but normally it's private to know that this company paid this amount of money in taxes. Normally, tax information is private. What other information? Yeah, I might say this, like sensible private information, medical, for example, information about sexual orientation, or information that might be subject to privacy regulations. Another recommendation would be if you, for example, are an institution and you're collecting information with final users, if you make, for example, a survey, when you give the survey to the users, they should know for sure what are you going to do with the data. So, for instance, normally in for example, a household survey, when you publish a database, you can identify individuals. You have, for example, information about a household. It's called anonymization of the data, so that you can't identify the specific users that provided that information, but that the information is disaggregated in an anonymized format, in an anonymous way, so that you can make calculations and create insights out of that data without identifying the people. So if you're gonna be the one that collects the information, you have to, the user has to know for sure what are the purposes, why are you collecting this information, and must agree with the privacy policies that you ask for in the information. But as I said, you shouldn't publish sensible information regarding individuals and be able to identify them. Something that sometimes it's a concern with people working in public institutions is, should my wages be public? And in a lot of legislations, you should be able, because these are wages that are being paid with public taxes, so the wages of the public servants are considered in a lot of countries public information, and you can identify the name of the person and its wage. And in that way you can monitor, for example, how is money being spent within the government. So as I said, please check your national legislation so that you are clear on what can or cannot publish.
He was asking regarding most common open structure format. Which is the most common open structure format, or is it irrelevant and can be adapted regardless for open data use? Camila, I believe your mic is muted.
Yes, now? Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. As I said before, there are a lot of open data formats. Okay. There are a lot of open data formats, as I said before, and it depends on the final users. The most common formats, as I said, is the CSV file, the RDF file, JSON files. What I recommend is that you can upload your datasets in different formats. For example, a CSV file can be easily transformed into an Excel file or a JSON file. So it shouldn't be that difficult to just, if you have your dataset in one format, then you can transform it to different formats. So as I said, the most widely used are CSV files or RDF, XML files. You can check the graph that's in the presentation to see which are the most common, but I recommend that you at first use CSV files because it's like the most widely used, I would say. And it also depends on your data. For example, as I said, if you're working with geospatial data, it might be better if you use GeoJSON or shape files instead of CSV, because it's not going to work that way.
Young, also from SocialTIC office, asked a question regarding sharing of information and difficulties accessing that. Have you had any experience dealing with institutions or departments that do not want to readily share information? If so, how were you able to eventually secure the data? If not, what would you recommend as the best approach to receive the data, to secure the data?
Yes, this is a problem that I've encountered as a journalist a lot of times, that when you ask for information, the institutions do not want to share it with you. And for instance, something that happened, and it's a process of talking with the institutions and making them see that the information, they are not the final owners of the information that they are collecting, that we, the citizens and the users, are the ones who own that information, so it should be available for everyone. I remember like maybe 4 years ago, we had a lot of these problems with the National Statistical Institute, that, for example, if you want to access a household survey to do research or analysis, you had to fill a lot of documents. They wouldn't give you the information if you weren't a researcher in the university, and it was quite difficult to get a data set. And I remember that one time we had, as I said, we don't have a law to access, a law of freedom of access to information here. So we had to put, I don't know how it's the translation exactly, so forgive me if I don't translate it right, but we had to go to the constitutional court to make a demand to access that information, and we luckily won the process. And this has been done since we don't have an access to information law. A lot of legislation and jurisprudence concerning access to information has been done by citizens who are denied information and had to go to the courts to ask institutions to publish the information. And this has been a long process. Right now, I'm glad to say that a lot of institutions have understood the importance of having information available in open formats, in structured formats. So what I would recommend is that first try, if you're denied information, try to talk to the institutions and make them understand that actually it's your right to get this information, and they have the obligation to give it to you. So if they are not quite used to providing information to the public, this might be a process, but you have to be really proactive and really insistent on the information that you want to get. So please try to talk and convince the institutions about this. They are not the owners of the information. They are just they just manage this information, and they have to make it accessible to the public because it's the right of the final users.
Gabriel Ball, also from Tito, he noted that you showed us the end products of the data cleaning operations. However, I know a lot is done behind the scenes to get the final product. What technologies do you use, recommend for automating the data cleaning operation? Perhaps some EL tools recommendations?
Well, it depends a lot on your technical capacities and what you're trying to achieve at the end, and what is the structure of the data. So a lot of the cleaning process can be done, for example, in spreadsheets. And the problem with this is that it's not automated. So if you have to clean a lot of databases at once, then you have to go through the process all over again. So if it's just one data set and it's not that complicated to clean it, then you can do it with spreadsheets. But there are also other types of software that I can share with you the link here at the end. There's one called OpenRefine that it's a really good program for cleaning operations. So you can work with large data sets there. You can store all the changes that you did, so you can automate the process. And also you can do clean operations with statistical programs like R, where also you can automate the code and run the cleaning operations with multiple data sets. You can do it with programming languages like Python. So it really depends on your technical capacities and the databases that you're working with. As I said, if it's something quite simple as deleting blank spaces, you can do it on a spreadsheet. But if it's more complicated, it might be better to use OpenRefine or R or Python in order to clean this data. As I said, I can share you some links about these tools and tutorials, and it just depends on the information that you're using.
He's asking in terms of large high definition files or images, archiving of large high definition images, video footage, movies, sound files, etc. Is there a cost effective way of archiving these files safely in your experience?
Well, to be completely honest, I'm not quite familiar with how do you store these files, unstructured files. As I said, I'm more focused on structured information as spreadsheets or databases. If you saw the graph that I showed earlier about the formats, for example, JPG files are considered open, but it's not structured information. So to be completely honest, I don't know which is the best way to store these files safely. Maybe it would be best to contact like a TI, like your TA department in your institution, so that to see and find ways on how to store this information. Would I recommend, for example, if there are some of this information stored in images or sounds or movies, is there a way to structure this information, or is it really necessary to upload this information online, or can we have it stored differently? So I would recommend that you talk to your TI department, and also to the people in your institution that.
Perfect. Thank you, Camila. I have a question from my end, and it's when you were making the presentation of getting the data, and you made a point of making an inventory of the data. I know a lot of public institutions, and I'm sure the participants will agree, that they have a wealth of data ready, but they don't know how to access it or how to structure it. So creating that inventory could be a very, very crucial first step without any huge overhead or expense. Could you, again, give us a little bit more detail regarding that section? Because I know it could be of use to our participants here in Belize.
Yes, as I said, institutions produce information on a daily basis, and they might not be aware of the amount of information that they produce. So an inventory would be basically a list. You just have to go through every department and try to, you can do this, for example, doing interviews and having meetings or discussion groups, and try to list all the information that you collect. So for example, this department collects information about budget, about spending, and for example, the budget information, it's stored in this specific database, and this other information is actually stored on paper, and the other department collects information about contracts that are stored on paper, etc. And once you make that list, my advice is that if you're going to start an open data process, okay, you have a list of, I don't know, 20 or 30 potential types of information and data sets that the institution has and collects, and you have to prioritize. And this prioritize which data sets are going to be subject first to structuring them and make them readily available in an open format. And this prioritization should be done considering two things. First, as I said, that the final demand, who is going to use this information, to consider always the final users, and also the resources of the institution. For example, if you already have, for example, budget information, it's something that it's quite useful for the final users. So this information might already be in a structured format, so the cleaning process and documentation might be easier than digitalizing paper contracts. So you should maybe prioritize the budget first, and then afterwards start digitalizing the information on paper. So it has to depend first, be sure what information do you have, think of the final users to see which information might be more valuable to them in order to prioritize it, and then start the prioritization.
And what if the amount of data is not a substantial amount, but it's important data? What do you recommend? Seeing maybe we might not have pages and pages of contract data, for example, or a new ministry, or sometimes ministries or departments merge, and you'd have new team members coming on board, or new responsibilities being taken under your wing. But it's important data. How do we go about not being discouraged to overlook that data if we don't have a wealth of data on hand?
I believe that the quantity of the data, the quality should be before quantity of the data. So we don't expect that that open data sets have to be huge data sets with thousands of hundreds of information. It can be a data set that has 50 observations. You might have only 20 contracts, but are the contracts that you have in your institution, and it's valuable information. So you shouldn't be stopped or have doubts to publish this information that is actually valuable just because you don't have that much information. As I said, also it might happen that, for example, with, I don't know, you want to start opening information about contracts in the government, and you might have 10 years of information back with a lot of contracts of the government. So something that you can do is, okay, well, I'm going to start digitalizing the contracts beginning in 2018. And this is going to be a process, and probably in 2 or 3 years, you're going to have a huge data set, and your data will look more vast. But the quantity at the beginning shouldn't stop you. What I said, the first thing to consider is if this information...
Camila, seeing that IT managers might not be at that sort of executive level or decision-making level within their ministry or department, how would you advise them to approach maybe that executive manager, that director, to start or embrace an open data policy within their organization? A lot of the IT managers, I would believe from my experience, tend not to be as proactive, or would not want to step on toes, if you will. They need that okay from the executive level desks, so to speak. So how would you encourage them, or what recommendations would you have for these IT managers that deal with these data and the persons creating the data to embrace or speak to that upper level management structure to embrace an open data policy within their organization?
Well, I think a key part of creating an open data policy inside an institution is to have public servants that are committed to the cause. And a good way to start is to have, it can be 1 or 2 persons that understand the importance of open data. And what I encourage them to do is to just knock the door and try to convince more people inside the institution to understand open data policies, open data principles, and to see how they can incorporate this on their daily work. Sometimes when we talk about starting open data processes inside institutions, people imagine that it's a lot of effort, that you have to change the way you do your daily work, but sometimes it might not be that difficult, and it might just be as easy as changing some specific practices that you do on a daily basis in order to start creating more open and accessible information. So what I recommend is that try to search for a couple of persons inside your institution that understand about open data, that are committed to improving and implementing open data policies, and try to make a structure present. You, for example, can do a structured presentation or a small meeting or event where you present this topic to other colleagues inside your institution, so that they understand the importance, and always keeping in mind why are you doing this, why it is important to open data. This has to be something that you really need to take into account to make people understand that you're not just opening data because it's cool to do open data right now. No, it's because it's something that might help you connect with the final users, that might make your institution more transparent, that might encourage creating new products.
Thank you, Camila. I see we have 2 questions here. One from Byron. He's with the Ministry of Public Service here in Belize. And I just asked if he could expand a bit on his question, but let's give it a go. He says, I believe we need to access what information should be made public or is in demand. Then we can have an idea of the volume or effort necessary. What's your recommendation? Assess, not access. We need to assess what information should be made public or is in demand. Then we can have an idea of the volume and effort necessary. And I believe that's what you spoke about in terms of that inventory
Yes, I think it relates a little bit about what I was talking before about knowing your final users and the demand in order to prioritize the datasets. And a good advice of knowing your demand, as I said, is you might go to the press office of your ministry and ask, okay, what is the information that the users normally ask here? And this might be a good indicator of, of, of knowing which information should you open. You can also make events. For example, if you have a public event where you invite journalists or citizens from NGOs, and you just ask them, okay, I'm starting this open data process, and I want to know what information can be valuable for you, so that I know for sure which information to open, and they might tell you. And this is important because what we see a lot is that institutions publish information that it's not really valuable for the final user. So you might invest a lot in your portal and upload your data sets, but at the end nobody's using them. So you really need to think, who are the final users?
And have a question from Inaldi Gomez from the Immigration Department here in Belize. The Belize government law states that government salaries and similar information should be public knowledge. Yet we have not seen this kind of information readily available and much less provided in a timely manner. Can you relate with something like this in other countries? What ministry is responsible to release this?
Yeah, sometimes institutions are not proactive on publishing this information, and that's what we need to address. For example, in the case of Costa Rica, each institution there's not like a centralized institution that publishes this information. So most of the ministries, each ministry has some ministries have an open data portal, some doesn't. So it depends on every institution. Right now, for example, there was an executive order about opening data in the country that states that every institution must publish this kind of information. So it's a process. Some institutions, as I said, have already published this, and some not. But something that might help is precisely this, so that the government, in an executive order or in an open data policy, states that every institution should publish this information. As I said, it's a process to make institutions proactive in publishing the information. It's not something that happens in one day or in 1 month. It's a long process. So, and it's important also to have a strong civil society always asking and pushing for this information to be open. It can be just from one side of the government. You need to have citizens involved in the open data community to push.
Considering that interministerial databases may have overlapping variables within, inherently there would be various approaches to the consolidation of these datasets. Approaches such as identifying and making one ministry the primary data source, or using cross-validation methods and extracting a final cleansed dataset that can be utilized. Any comments on what approach can be used in such scenarios?
Okay. Regarding connecting different data sets, the basic principle is that you have to have unique identifiers in common so that you can merge different data sets. So the idea is, when you start these open data policies, you should have some standards on how to structure this information so that the databases can connect. And for example, the example that I put before about the social programs of the government, if they are gonna implement an open policy, an interoperable policy within their databases, they should all have a meeting and agree on what are the standards and the variables that they are gonna use, and that they're gonna structure with these databases so that they can connect with each other. So yes, if I don't know if I answered your question, extracting a final clean data. Okay, yes, no, my first approach is that you must have, as I said, databases that can be combined. And to do this, you have to have unique identifiers. So for example, you have a unique ID of the region, so that if you use the ID number of a region in different government datasets, almost have the same ID number, so that you don't have errors when merging these datasets. And
it speaks to the interoperability portion of your presentation. Okay, I have a curious question on my end, Camila. Throughout the presentation, you noted that some forms of information comes in the closed format PDF, in tables, or they come via letters that are not already in an open data format. I'm curious to understand or know, because those PDFs, they still play a role. For example, during presentations from our statistical institute here in Belize, they provide overviews of trends, for example, in the economy, unemployment, inflation, etc. And the tables are easily readable for different end users, while open data would be for a different group, a different demographic. So when you're talking about making or identifying the primary source of that information, because as you mentioned, that primary source would exist, but not necessarily in an open data format. I'm curious as to the workflow, because the Statistical Institute, for example, what I've seen thus far in their reports are all these charts, these diagrams, these tables that are neat, are very attractive to view and look at. So again, I guess my main point is, how do we change or introduce that workflow where they have all that information to then move into creating these open data formats and data sets within these institutions that are predominantly information based?
okay, yeah, I think the best advice that I can give you is that, okay, it's okay to publish your report with charts and pre-analyzed tables in a PDF format, because, as you said, this information might be useful for some end users. But try to think also of other users that are interested, for example, in the every year the National Institute has publishes their household survey, and they make a PDF report, they make a press event where they give all the journalists the PDF report. But what happens if you're a journalist that is interested in making other calculations or crossing other variables that are not available in the PDF, in the analysis that the Institute made? And you have to think of those users also. As an institution, this doesn't imply extra work for you, because the only thing that you have to do is to publish your PDF report and also publish the database accessible for download. And that's what I mean when thinking about different types of users. It's okay to use your PDF, but if this PDF is based on databases and structured information, make this information accessible also. Because sometimes what happens, for example, I remember a report done by the Planning Institute here that did an index of social progress in all the different districts in the country. And the report was complete, and they had all the tables of the index on a PDF file. So they didn't make the Excel file available, so I had to transform this using programs like Tabula or other programs. I had to transform it into an Excel file in order to make my own map and my graphs and my analysis. And this is an extra step that you're forcing the users to do. And there also might be users that do not know that they can actually extract information from that PDF. So,
excellent. Thank you, Camila. We have another question from Byron. Do you recommend just providing the raw data, or should the portal provide analytical tools that end users can use?
I think it depends first on the technical infrastructure that you have. There are a lot of portals. For example, if you think at the World Bank Open Data portal, that yes, you can download the data sets, but you can also play with in the website and see some charts and tables, etc. I believe it depends. For example, interactive chart tools online, they're pretty useful for some users. But what you should not do is to publish only the platform where you can do the graphs and the tables, but you cannot download the primary data set. And this is a common mistake that a lot of institutions do. I remember, for example, this year, I don't remember if it was at the beginning of the year or at the end of last year, that the government here published a website that it was a map of all the infrastructure works around the country. So you can search, there was a search engine, and you can search in your community which projects were being made, etc., etc. But it was just an interactive map, and you couldn't download the database that was used to create that map. And for example, I couldn't do a calculation on, okay, how many projects are active right now in the country, or how many infrastructure projects are being built in my community. I couldn't do that because I didn't have access to the raw data. I just had the interactive tool. So this is what you shouldn't do. When I talked to the government officials in charge, they said, well, the database, it's going to be open in a few months, so it's the second stage of the project. I wouldn't recommend that. First, make the data set available, the raw data, and then you can add other functionalities like.
Camila, I see Byron seems he might be typing another question or making a comment, but I see that. Yes, the comment. Thanking you. Okay, great. Are there any more questions, guys? I know that we're running up close to time. Mike, any questions or any comments on your end? I see that we have Juan Pablo also typing.
Thank you, Henry. No, but we're 8 minutes away from closing time. So I wanted to suggest you to start wrapping up. There's a lot of insightful information that Camila has provided in this session. Thank you. The presentation, the video, and the chat with the links and everything will be provided to all participants. I should say that there's a lot of good questioning on this presentation. I want to point out that, as I've seen in the case of Costa Rica, which is very close to Camila, I've seen how they progressed on changing their mentality, institutional culture, if you may, government culture, from switching to kind of closest culture to obviously the open culture. It's not easy. One thing that helped in the process, and I would like to say and point out to it, was our intervention with the Organization of American States on what is called the Open Data National Roundtable that we implemented, and with that we worked on supporting Costa Rica in the development of their open data policy. Camila mentioned. I can see this conversation going on the first part of that national dialogue table that we had in Costa Rica, where the questions were about precisely why do we need to open this data with name, amounts, so on and so forth, that will compromise us. It compromise our security. People is going to rob us. People is going to kidnap us. Well, you can imagine all kind of discussions that went on it. But hopefully that was a starting point. I would like to think that this session is a starting point also in that change. If we measure now the impact of opening the data in Costa Rica on those specific subjects, that probably without having in-depth study of that. Obviously, here with me, I can say that it was minimum of non-existent. But yes, a lot of the attributes that Camila pointed out are very important. The data doesn't belong to the institution. And I think that's something that it also needs to be sensitized as we move along. It's information that can be shared with others, other ministries or institutions. That's important. The principle of interoperability there, it's very important. But obviously, it's public good, and as a public good, it could be taken, by anyone, and add value to that data. So those principles, we need to start grasping those principles, start working, start changing culture, and I think that would be ideal. So cultural change is important. The national dialogue table, the dialogues that we implemented in Costa Rica also supported on that cultural change, and laying out the foundations of a lot of things that were showcased here by Camila in terms of the standards, basically, the infrastructure, that is not just a technological infrastructure that needs to be in place for opening data. Agree heavily in what Camila said. Quality better before quantity. Very important. I pointed out on the chat. Good example of that is Canada, who in the beginning run quickly to start opening data sets and open over 400,000 data sets that recently downsized to 80,000. 80,000 is still a lot of data sets, but think about 400,000 against 80,000 data sets published and available by the government of Canada. So they went through a process of spending a lot of money and resources, and effort in opening 400,000 data sets, to realize later that it was data that it was not being used, and that one needed to be, that it was costing also, because the storage and having it available was causing also a financial burden. It start downsizing and prioritizing based on usage, and that's what is important. So I think that's an attribute that is very important to grasp. And of course, we hope that this project, and Henry Wade will coach you all in the process of implementation of this project in different ways that the project can support in advancing in all those questions that you had, as a commitment of the project. And of course, this won't be only a virtual encounter. We're going to be on site in Belize City, Belmopan, in Belize in general, as we had this early this year with Rodrigo Iriani from the Trust, and of course Henry Wade on the ground. We're gonna come back. We're precisely programming all the activities that will take place inside, on site, additional training, national dialogue table, and best practice exchange forum as well. That all combined will produce specific products that we like to see as proposals for the policy, for example, in the national strategy on open data or the infrastructure, and of course thinking about the projects that could be implemented down the road with this project, with the seed money that this project will provide to those ones who participate. So just saying all that to wrap up this session and try to provide a perspective to everything that Camila spoke about here. And I want to thank you, Camila. I want to thank the School of Data. I want to thank SocialTIC as well. Thank you for being engaged. I'm sure this will be the first, not the last time that we enjoy your insights. We hope to see you connected to the rest of the project somehow. We'll continue to make that happen. But thank you for all the insights, and for all the participants as well. Thank you. So Henry, I'll leave it there, and I'll let you close the session.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Yes, guys, as Mike said, there's some exciting activities pending and coming in the months ahead. We're excited about that. As you know, I like to share my contact information and our Facebook page. So please see that in the comment section below. Again, Camila, thank you so much for such an informative session. Also want to thank all our participants. I know we've had some who joined us a little bit late today, but that's still good. You guys decided to join us today. And I also want to share that we're going to be sharing links to the attachments for the presentations provided. Previous emails, you should have all three presentations. And the videos, we've uploaded those to YouTube. They're easily accessible. Yes, thanks, Mike. Yes, we'll be forwarding those to the team. And again, guys, as I said, please feel free to connect to our Facebook page, like our page, share your thoughts and comments, and also feel free to share the page with your friends. We're building an ecosystem here in Belize. We want to change mindsets. We want open government. We want open data here. So this is just the foundation. So we need all your help. We need all your support. Again, thanks to all our participants. Camila, thank you so much. And if there are any questions, guys, anything that maybe during the course of today or reviewing any of the sessions you come across, please feel free to email me, and we can then forward those to our experts for their response. So again, thank you so much. Camila, if there's anything else you'd like to share.
No, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity. I hope this session was useful and that I look forward to see how you implement these policies in Belize. So if you had any questions also, I'm going to share my email on the chat. So feel free if something was left out of this talk and you're interested in knowing, and I can help you. So thank you very much, Mike and Henry. So it's a pleasure, and I hope that I could contribute with you in the future. So good luck with your projects and your open data policies over there.
Thanks so much, Camila. So Mike, I think we close the session now. We'll be sharing the information via email with the team.
Thank you, Henry, also for moderating. Thank you all. Thank you to Cito, and I'll see you next week with the final two sessions. Final two sessions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And Camila shared her email. Thanks again, Camila. Have a wonderful day ahead, guys. Thank you all.